right. So we'll get started with the third session, as some people are still coming in. Good evening, and my name is Frank Gazzardo, and I'm the Donor Relations Manager at the Polish Humanitarian Action, and I will be moderating the third session on the Grand Bargain and its policy versus practice. We'll have a slightly different setup here. We won't have a legal perspective, but we will have a keynote speaker, and then we will break directly into discussion. We've had some really compelling and interesting conversations today. I hope the energy level is still with us, and because this is, let's say, a very important panel on the Grand Bargain Agreement and the challenges and opportunities that come from this agreement. Needless to say, this panel is very fitting for a conference that talks about opportunities and challenges. So first we'll take an interagency perspective, and then we'll zoom into the NGO perspective with some examples, and we'll discuss further. I won't go into much detail because there's a lot of experience and a lot of experience and expertise on the panel, and I probably wouldn't do the subject justice on my own. So I would like to first introduce Swati Abida from Norwegian Church Aid. Swati is the Regional Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation, Reporting Coordinator for the Middle East program for Norwegian Church Aid. To her right is Ann Street. Ann Street is the head of humanitarian policy at Catholic International Development Charity, CAFOD. And then over to the right of Ann, we have Andras Derzsi-Horvath, who is the project manager at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. He works on projects related to humanitarian action and peace and security with a focus on governance, financing, and non-Western actors. This year in June, Andras co-authored the GPPI's independent Grand Bargain report 1 year from the adoption of the agreement. So without further ado, I'd like to give Andras the floor.
Well, thank you. Do you hear me? Okay, great. So maybe I'm just going to stay here instead of standing up and to the podium. Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And it was great to witness today that kind of critical self-reflection, which I think is very healthy and very good to have in this sector. Starting from Professor Bragg's presentation, asking whether we're fighting new wars with old armies and old tactics, are international humanitarian actors still relevant? Are we still relevant when there's just so many changes happening, tectonic changes in terms of technology, which allows financial transfers to beneficiaries, when there international anti-terrorism legislation, which limits our access to population, or which limits the access of populations to some of the humanitarian services, as well as less and less respect for IHL by all actors. And I think in this panel, what we're going to talk about is how this continuous self-reflection actually materializes within the humanitarian community. So what are the international humanitarian actors doing, the UN, international NGOs, etc., to get better at what they're doing? And so the Grand Bargain is basically about that. It is the last global effort to improve humanitarian action. The Grand Bargain is the cornerstone of commitments that major governments and aid organizations agreed to at the World Humanitarian Summit. It loosely fits in a chain of earlier reforms, which by and large responded to the side effects of growth in the sector, a growth in the number of aid organizations and the volume of money spent on aid. According to recent estimates, about 25 billion US dollars were spent last year on international humanitarian aid. In 2012, so only 4 years earlier, the international community spent about 15 billion, so that is 10 billion less than in 2016. There's also a growth in the number of active aid organizations, and here I would go back to the comment made, the powerful comment made by Alejandro, MSF's Alejandro earlier. He said that they feel lonely in many contexts, and that is true. That is indeed in the most dangerous context, there are only a handful of active aid organizations. But in most places where conditions are more forgiving, a large variety of aid actors operate, each with its specialized program. In some crisis responses, especially which follow a sudden onset natural disaster, the number of aid actors becomes dizzying. So think of the response to the Haiti earthquake or the tsunami response in Sri Lanka. So with so many actors on the ground and so much money mobilized, there's a growing expectation to make an impact on the lives of people affected by armed conflict and natural disasters. Increasingly, the loose assembly of humanitarian actors is seen as part of a system that ought to work as a whole. Yet, of course, there are overlaps in activities and there remain gaps in geographic and programmatic coverage. So addressing these shortcomings, gaps in coverage and overlaps in activities has been the primary objective of interagency reforms to date. And the first such reform in 2005, the humanitarian reform, aimed to improve coordination among aid organizations through clustering them thematically. 5 years later, the so-called transformative agenda created a new mechanism to ensure quick, system-wide response to sudden onset natural disasters, drawing mainly on the lessons of the 2010 Haiti earthquake and the 2010 Pakistan floods. In many ways, the Grand Bargain continues this tradition to create a more coherent humanitarian system. It commits donors and aid organizations to improve their joint planning process, to extend the time frame of this joint planning process from 1-year plans to multi-year plans where possible, and to achieve more durable solutions, cooperate better with development actors. But the Grand Bargain also includes provisions at the level of individual actors. Building on earlier processes, the Grand Bargain makes proposals on how aid actors can improve their practice. Gone are the days when the Red Cross, religious charities, and a few others would deploy with a cowboy-like mentality and conviction to help the most vulnerable. Humanitarian action has undergone a long process of professionalization driven by aid workers themselves, which has resulted in global quality and performance benchmarks. The Grand Bargain takes the debate on accountability to affected people one step further, proposing to include crisis-affected people in decisions about their lives. It proposes increasing the use of crash transfer programs, and it asks to rely more on local actors. And we will discuss especially these two topics in the panel today. Donors too should change their practices. Notably, donors have pledged to decrease the earmarking of their contributions, which could increase the flexibility of aid organizations to respond to evolving needs rather than being tied to earlier plans. In sum, then, the Grand Bargain tackles how individual organizations improve their own practices and how they can work better together. A third group of Grand Bargain commitments, and this is the last group, relates to costs. In fact, efficiency is the main selling point of the Grand Bargain. All 10 issue areas included in the deal, from cash to multi-year planning, are justified on the premise that implementing commitments will result in savings. At a time when the gap between needs and available resources only appears to increase, I think it is a reasonable aspiration to deliver more for less. But of course, the Grand Bargain is not only about costs, and I tried to highlight that in my earlier points. But indeed, there are a few points in the Grand Bargain which tackle cost savings heads on. For example, there are important gains to be made from harmonizing the due diligence processes and reporting requirements. It sounds rather dry and boring, with reporting and all that stuff, but effectively, this might be one of the biggest step and one of the most promising area of reform that the grand bargain can deliver. One NGO estimates that it could save an astounding 11,000 hours in annual staff time if its largest donors had a common reporting template. The grand bargain hopes to cut costs at the level of individual organizations too, for example, by increasing financial transparency. And it's astounding, and I'm still shocked how unclear it is that when we drop $1 into the system, we don't know how many cents of that dollar actually reaches aid beneficiaries. There's a total black box that we are not aware of. How much, it takes to make this machine work. So no doubt the grand bargain sets an amazing variety of objectives, but will it deliver? 18 months after the grand bargain's adoption, I cannot answer that question in earnest. But in the next 2 minutes, I'll try to bring 2 examples from my work to illustrate where I see areas which give grounds for optimism and where I see clear risk of failure. So let's start with the positive. The grand bargain has all the ingredients to make it a success. The grand bargain sets objectives rather than obsessing with the question of how to get to that objective. This allows every actor to find their own path to reach those. This spring, we assessed progress made against the grand bargain commitments, and we found the signatories have made good progress in implementing changes within their organizations, especially where the grand bargain specified concrete targets. This means that on average, each grand bargain signatory took concrete steps to improve on 40% of the 51 grand bargain commitments. Now, this may not sound as much, but considering the wide range of topics covered and less than 1 year had passed at the time of our assessment, I think this is good progress, even though, of course, I wish for more. And there are some reports that I've left on that desk if you're interested in a little bit more detail about our assessment. Second, the grand bargain's overarching aim to increase efficiency has affected the follow-up positively. It remains a very strong narrative to cut the red tape and dispense resources currently used and expense sitting in front of blinking computer screens and use those resources in the response instead. We were very positively surprised during our assessment about the high priority attached to keeping a small bureaucratic footprint. This is particularly refreshing because earlier reforms had quickly become bloated. Sure, despite this attention, we noted an increase in time spent in meetings and other processes geared to ensure proper follow-up of grand bargain commitments. But I think this can be understood as a natural consequence of any change process. Without a push in the beginning, there's little prospect for meaningful change. Ideally, we'll see a decrease in these kind of additional resources used to administer the grand bargain as soon as signatories reach consensus in areas where the text was unclear, and the text was unclear in a number of areas. To give you an example, there's still no shared understanding of what it means to give more money, quote, as directly as possible, unquote, to local actors. Currently, and this has been said before today, local NGOs receive less than 1% of direct funding from Western governments. So getting clarity on what it means to reach a 25%, so a shift from 1 to 25% target potentially by 2020 has clear financial and political implications. Third, the grand bargain is the first global reform that binds aid organizations and donors into an agreement where each contributes its share. This is a radical departure from earlier reforms where donors were not seen as part of the problem or seen as part of the solution either. We found that the give and take, the quid pro quo between donors and aid organizations played an instrumental role in creating a package deal with potentially transformative effects. The grand bargain includes long-standing demands by both donors and aid organizations, where each group has failed to use carrots or stick to make the other change. So instead of endlessly pleading for less earmarked donor funding on the one hand, and more financial transparency on the other hand, the grand bargain offers an opportunity where each group can deliver where it realistically can, that is on its own practice, and expect changes in the counterpart's behavior as a result. However, the quid pro quo, the give and take between donors and aid organizations, entails risks, and this is where I turn to the second example. A few months ago, we looked into the Syria response to identify ways to operationalize the grand bargain in this context, and we focused on getting insights from key aid organizations, the UN, NGOs, as well as large government and donors. This was not a thorough review of the Syria response, so please treat our findings with care. We found that, most of our findings on the grand bargain were rather uncontroversial. For example, there was a shared willingness to increase the use of cash transfer programs. Of course, there remained a lot of technical challenges to do that. Similarly, there was a shared willingness to rely more on local actors. In Syria already there's a quite high reliance on local actors because of access constraints. And there was also a healthy debate whether multi-year plans made sense in this highly volatile context. But there was no progress in the thorniest issues that form part of this give and take between donors and aid organizations. Indeed, our findings in Syria expose not only a deadlock in implementing grand bargain commitments, but that this grand bargain has resulted in decreased trust between donors and aid organizations. Specifically, donors complained that the United Nations focused in their response on areas where they had easy access instead of prioritizing people with greater needs in hard to access, hard to reach areas. Therefore, donors demanded that aid organizations get significantly better at joint planning processes, publish their findings and analysis transparently. In the opposite camp, so aid organizations, they claimed they had already made significant improvements, and they saw no change in donor practices in return, no reward, basically. Indeed, most representatives we spoke to claimed that donors had increased rather than decreased their earmarking, and increased rather than decreased their reporting demands. But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, and rather leave you with a few thoughts on how to ensure the grand bargain becomes a success, what I think is going to be important moving forward. So one is to continue expanding the grand bargain's membership. The grand bargain already includes key donors and aid organizations that comprise the lion's share, about 70% of humanitarian aid funds today. But very few NGOs have signed up to the grand bargain. Two here are exceptions. And with one exception, all government donors are OECD countries. So while you have, the bulk of the money and the bulk of the actors part of it, it's still not representative of the variety of actors that are out there, that are on the field actually implementing programs and doing the work. Second, it would be important to shift the attention away from discussions in neon-lit rooms in Geneva, New York, and Rome to the crisis contexts. And even in places in places like Syria, where the grand bargain has raised the stakes but failed to deliver, it is worth going back to the basics. It is worth establishing what the two groups of actors, aid organizations and donors, consider part of the core bargain. Game theory tells us that the grand bargain's recipe is appropriate, but the two sides should at minimum be aware that they are they are in the process of a bargain and what the basic rules of this bargain are. What are the benefits of cooperation, and what is the price of defection? So to make the grand bargain a success, actors on the ground should make their expectations explicit, but also they make sure that they communicate what the rewards of compliance will be. And last, a plea to you on how to how to make the grand bargain a success. You should keep pressure on leading humanitarian actors to make progress. This particularly relates to the two most promising issue areas, localization and the increased use of cash. Without public or peer pressure, collective achievements will always fall short of our aspirations. And to go back to the very beginning where we started, will all of this bring us to a completely reformed new system, and I'm very curious about your reflections on that as well. I think the Grand Bargain offers a very interesting and a promising recipe. It is more promising than earlier reforms. It is also more risky, as the Syria case showed. But I believe that there are always limits to self-reform. It's always, you know, humanitarian actors getting together, aid organizations, donors, how can we improve ourselves? And ultimately, the disruption will happen from outside. It will happen from technological advancements. It will happen from emerging donors setting up an alternative system, what have you. So you know, this is when I think we will see a true a change in current practice. Thank you very much.
Andras. Yeah? Okay. Andras, thank you very much for that thought-provoking speech, and I like the way that you ended with that there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of promise, and there's two sides to the coin. I would like to now kind of zoom in into the localization. Andras also spoke on this on a couple areas in his opening speech, and we'll zoom in and look at localization from a NGO perspective. Just to give a kind of an introduction or a reintroduction of the localization, I have a feeling that most people in this room are very well aware, but just so we're all on the same page, we will be talking about the more support and funding tools for local and national responders. And the IASC definition here on the work stream is national and local responders comprising governments, communities, Red Cross, and Red Crescent national societies, and local civil society are often the first to respond to crises, remaining in the communities they served before, after, and during emergencies. Signatories are committed to making principled humanitarian action as local as possible and as international as necessary, recognizing that international humanitarian actors play a vital role, particularly in situations of armed conflict. We engage with local and national responders in a spirit of partnership and aim to reinforce rather than replace local and national capacities. And one commitment that I would like to underline here that we were talking about that Andras introduced was the goal for 2020, the global goal would be the aggregated target of at least 25% of humanitarian funding to local and national responders as directly as possible to improve outcomes for affected people and reduce transactional costs. And there's, just in the wording of the commitment, there's ambiguity. There isn't a consensus yet, and the conversation continues. So I would like to to our partners here on the panel, and I'd like to ask Swati to tell us a little bit about your experience and also tell us a little bit what Norwegian Church Aid does.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you all, because I'm so happy to see there are still some faces, and they are interesting to, you know, they are interested to know more about localization. Thank you very much for coming in. In terms of localization, when you sent me a set of questions, I was like, okay, how we can elaborate around those questions, because if you ask me, NCA is now 70 years old organization, established in 1947. We are present in 30 countries. And we are working with local partners. I cannot recall any other country except Iraq, northern Iraq, where NCA is operational, and rest everywhere, it's the local partners we are working with. So that is one aspect, and then just to give you an idea that in NCA we have two envelopes. One is this big, and the other one is like this much. So this much is basically for local actors, local partners, national actors, and this is for us. So in this regard, I think that NCA is very well placed in terms of the promoting and actually implementing the agenda of localization. Most of our resources are for our partners because they know the context better. They are very well aware of the local context. They have linkages. They know the situation on ground. They have, they know the community needs, and they are there to respond like in 24 hours. So, one more thing which is very important for you to know that for us, a local partner is not a mean to achieve an end, but a well-resourced and empowered and with the capacity to scale up partner is basically an end for us. This is what we want to achieve in NCA. In terms of our experience, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, that we are present in 30 countries in one way or the other. We are working in water sanitation and hygiene promotion programs. We are implementing gender-based violence and reproductive health programs, peace building, and climate resilience. I think that everything is partner-led. Local partners are implementing. So I think that in this work stream of localization, we have a lot of experience and knowledge and lessons learned to share with others who are now stepping into the business of localization, I would say. And then we can also, which we are actually doing at the moment, is the advocacy. Under this Charter for Change, which I'm sure all of you are aware of that. This is an initiative led by local and national, international organizations, and they are committed and they are now advocating on the agenda of localization, where there is a need to bring in more resources and capacity building for the local actors to come in the field and lead the humanitarian response on ground. So we are active, for instance, on the network of Voice and Equa, and we are collaborating with ACT Alliance members and then non-ACT NGOs and NGOs as well. So at the moment, this is what I can share, and I think that for us, one more thing. This is a very common expression in Norwegian church aid. We say that bring more money in and give more money out. So that's how we work. So thank you. We will continue. Yeah, thank you.
Then I'll give the floor to Anne.
Thanks, Frank. And thank you all for staying. I think a key quality for humanitarian workers is endurance and long days. So you made it on this one. So thanks. Just before I begin, I'd just be really interested in a show of hands as to how many of you had heard of the Grand Bargain before this session. Wow. So most people. That's encouraging, because I have to say, at the policy level where I work, it has increasingly taken up a lot of our time and attention. So it's good to know that it's filtered out. So I work for CAFOD, which is the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, and we're part of the Caritas family. And we are actually one of the few NGOs that signed up to the Grand Bargain. So the bargain was signed and announced, as Andras said, at the World Humanitarian Summit in May of 2016, and CAFOD signed up to it some months later, as we recognised that actually it was very important to be part of that change movement, but also to be part of the policy influencing into the grand bargain space. And for us particularly, the localization agenda has been really important. So we're a partner led organisation. We work through local actors. Similar to NCA, we don't implement ourselves, excepting in very rare situations. And so we've actually been working in the policy arena since about 2011, 2012, trying to promote the whole issue of partnership working. So we did some of the first research that actually evidenced just how little money local and national actors were receiving directly. And this really sort of started some of the discussion around the inequities in the system and the inefficiencies related to this. But we also were working to try to evidence the effectiveness and the efficiency of working through local actors. So trying to build up the evidence, looking at where the limitations were, but also looking at where the strengths are. And some of the research that we did through the Missed Opportunities series of research in sort of 2012, 2013 has fed into the localization debate and driving the policy framework forward. So I want to just say a little bit perhaps about some of the work that CAFOD has done in relation to the grand bargain localization work stream. So there are 6 commitments within the work stream 2, which is more support and funding tools to local and national actors. And they could be broadly described as commitments around capacity development, capacity support, coordination and voice, and tracking and funding. And as Frank said, the target of 25% funding as directly as possible to national and local actors by 2020 is, I think, one of only 2 specific targets in the entire 53 commitments of the grand bargain. So that was really strong, actually, and really bold. So we've been working through the IASC Humanitarian Financing Task Team. And immediately after the World Humanitarian Summit and the announcing of the grand bargain, we agreed through this Humanitarian Financing Task Team that we actually need to put on our work plan the commitment that looks at tracking. So the commitment of the grand bargain on localization was to develop a localization marker in order to track that 25%. So we set up a subgroup of the Humanitarian Financing Task Team. And I think one of the challenges and the weaknesses of the grand bargain has been that it's very HQ-led and driven. So all the signatories, excepting one now, a year and a half after the signing, are international actors. So there's no national actors in the discussion. So the group we set up, this localization worker marking group, we said it was a IASC plus group, and we worked very hard to get local actors into that group who would make a contribution and would be part of the discussion and bring their insights and expertise. So we worked for 18 months to both look at whether we should, how a localization marker would look like, what it should do, but also we needed to address the definitions, because that is absolutely key to the discussion. So here are all these big donors, these UN agencies, these NGOs. They've made this commitment to pass 25%, but they've said as directly as possible. What does that mean? And what is 25%? Is that 25% just money? Or the likes of some of the big UN agencies, World Food Programme, that delivers mainly food, would like to say it includes food. The Australian government, that does a lot of capacity support to governments in Southeast Asia, would like it to include all the money that they spend supporting local governments and national governments and doing capacity development. So you can see there that a nice little phrase that looks very good is actually riven with politics. So and on the group we also had not just the IASC, so UN and NGOs, but we also had donors. So we had 4 donors in the conversation and local actors. And we, at the end of the process, we recommended to the Grand Bargain signatories that they don't introduce a localization marker, because we felt, and there's, as Andras said, there's a very strong work stream in the Grand Bargain on transparency and improving the systems that we have for reporting. So we felt, after doing a lot of research and analysis and discussion with lots of actors, that we didn't need another framework, another reporting mechanism, that it wouldn't be used, that it would be partial, only half used, and all these things are only as good as the energy and investment that goes into it. So what we recommended was that actually we need to build up the reporting through EARTI and the OCHA-run financial tracking service, and that these need to be made more fit for purpose for tracking funding to local and national actors. So that was one part of the work that we did so I co-chaired it with OCHA and with development initiatives. But the other part we did was looking at the definitions, and this is hugely contested because so what is a national actor? What is a local actor? So there are some international NGOs that, because they've registered in Kenya or Somalia or Sri Lanka and have got a board of local people, say that they're a national actor. So if that was the case, then they would get the 25% of the money and that would be fine. But actually that wasn't the spirit of the World Humanitarian Summit. I mean, the spirit of the World Humanitarian Summit was thousands and thousands of local actors who said, we have been squeezed out and ignored by international actors. We're not in the coordination mechanisms. If we are, we're not really heard. We're marginalised. Decisions are made without us. And so what they were saying, And I think what the Grand Bargain localisation commitment spoke to was that actually this is to indigenous, local organisations that are locally founded, locally run and locally led. So we did a big consultation process with a survey we pushed out as far and wide as possible. And actually, most of the respondents we got were local and national actors. We got 600, nearly 600 did that survey. And it came back very clearly that national actors national and local actors should include local governments and national governments, and that international NGOs would not count as part of the 25%. We did, however, recommend that actually we need to introduce a new category, which is internationally affiliated organisations. So those INGOs that have registered in the domains in which they operate are internationally affiliated rather than national. And then we looked at the issue of as direct as possible. So initially people wanted it only to be from a donor, so from ECHO or the German government or the US government directly to a national actor, or through the UN pooled funds. So the OCHA runs, I think it's 14 country-based pooled funds at the moment, and that's actually the main way that national actors directly access funding. Although having said that, it's actually only 18% of the pooled funds go to national and local actors, so there's still a long way to go on that. However, it was very obvious from talking to donors that there's no way they can fund directly to local actors. It's just not going to happen. So the compromise was that it would go through one layer. So it would go from a donor to a UN agency or an INGO, and then or a pooled fund, and then to a national actor. It is a compromise, but I think we will be able to see when the tracking happens, actually, whether that's getting more money into local actors. And there have been lots of cases where there's a long chain. So this way we would eliminate the chain. So we might go from a donor to a UN agency to an INGO to another INGO in its family, then to a national actor, and maybe then to a local actor. So the idea is to eliminate that or to reduce that chain. I could go on a lot more, but I think I could see Frank looking at me. So I hope I've given it a little bit of a flavor.
You did. Thank you very much for that CAFOD perspective. I see that there's a lot of work being done in the organization, not only activities, but also in the conversation, the dialogue. One thing that caught my ear was when Swati was talking about the Charter for Change. And this was from 2015. So what I would like to ask is how has the Grand Bargain changed your organization's approach to localization? Has it changed? And I assume there's been a lot of work already been done on localization before the Grand Bargain. So maybe Swati, if I could.
Thank you. As I said earlier, NCA's approach of working is that it's our response, whether it's humanitarian work or it's development work, it's partner-led. So if you look at the policy document which we have, as in look at the global strategy, our partnership strategy, humanitarian, global humanitarian strategy, advocacy strategy, communication strategy, and we are also CHS certified organization. So I think that in this regard, we are already very well placed. So it's nothing new that we are now changing the organization approach towards localization. We are already for localization. What is what is happening after localization, as in now there is a lot of discussion, as you said, as in for us it's not head office driven. It's our country offices are very much aware of that, and they are also, you know, they make sure that we work with local partners. But then there is a discussion now, and then if you allow me, I have some notes just in order to make sure that I don't miss anything. After the localization a discussion and charter for change, we have started you know, working on commitment 2, which is related to partnership, and then we have, you know, started developing more elaborated guidelines for the partnership, and then more capacity building of and sensitization of our country offices and also the partner organizations. Then recruitment, related to recruitment, which is commitment 4. NCA has developed a standard HR manual which can be used by countries and by the local organizations also. In terms of advocacy, we are working with governments, with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then we give them feedback if the agenda of localization is not there, so we make sure that they talk about that and they allocate resources where possible. And then in terms of, as in, there is a lot of initiatives around commitments, which is equality. The one challenge which we face when we work with local organization is the capacity, and it's that their ability to scale up to the required level. So we are actually putting a lot of efforts on accompaniment. We provide a lot of support in terms of capacity building, and capacity building for us is not only a kind of training. We organize few trainings and that's it. No, it's the support for partners to build their system, to establish SOPs. It's related to program, it's related to security management, and capacity building around all issues which we have been discussing since morning on humanitarian access and international humanitarian law and all issues. So I think that this is what we have changed a little bit, but I think a lot has been done even before the Charter for Change and Localization discussion in 2016. Yeah.
See, Andras there would like to input? Or
yeah, sure.
or no?
Yeah, no, yes, I'm happy to. Yes, because I think the question that you ask is basically, you know, if most of these issues that we're talking about, from localization and cash and all of that, so there was already progress ahead of the grand bargain. That does it really make a difference to have these big global reforms, to have this grand bargain? I mean, we're already making progress, right? So the Charter of Change, when it comes to localization, was very strong and already promoting a very strong localization agenda. So do these big reforms make any sense? And, you know, that is a question that interests me a lot. And I think they do. I think we do need to collect evidence on it. It's not obvious. But ultimately, all these voluntary reforms, because the grand bargain is a voluntary agreement, it's a trap. It's a trap for organizations that sign up for it, because they make public commitments. They say, yes, we will do this. We will voluntarily do this. And once you say that, then you can be held to account. Have you done it? Have you delivered? If you're not, you know, engaging in these kind of like public announcements, public commitments, then you cannot be held to account, not as much perhaps. And I imagine this is why, you know, a number of NGOs have not yet sign up to the Grand Bargain. It's also, you know, for management of NGOs, management of the UN, it's a very important point of reference. So all these grand documents, you know, and it's not only the Grand Bargain, but also, you know, the movement on the refugee compact, the movement on linking this humanitarian development divide, the new way of working. All of these offer a point of reference for management to justify why they do what they do in the organization. So it's like how they steer the organization. This is like, yes, we sign up for this organization, and then it's certain priorities, and we have to match those priorities. And these priorities in the Grand Bargain are the 10 issue areas, you know, that part of which we talked about. So I think it's actually a very effective instrument to have these big, grand announcements. I think it's ultimately a good thing to have them, yeah.
Thank you for that, Andras. So I'll relay the question back to Anne about what has CAFOD done prior to the Grand Bargain, and when did that momentum start?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I talked a little bit about some of the research that we'd done earlier, but I think as you referred, the Charter for Change was really the thing that we worked on prior to the Grand Bargain. So the Charter for Change was co-founded by 4 organisations, so CAFOD, Dan Church Aid, Christian Aid, and Adesso, which is a Kenyan organisation. And it really grew out of the discussions at the World Humanitarian Summit, where it was very obvious that a lot of actors were talking about the need for change, but they were all talking about how everybody else has to change, but not about what we needed to change ourselves. So we felt that was really important, that we needed to evidence what we needed to do to change. So we came up with these 8 commitments to change the way that we as international NGOs work with local actors. It's now actually been signed by 30 INGOs, so both the ACT Alliance, many ACT Alliance members, and I think 7 Caritas members, but also some of the big INGOs that recognise that this is the way the future is going to look like. So we're going to move from from a situation where INGOs are always implementing agencies to working much more collaboratively and much more in partnership with local actors. So Oxfam has signed it, CARE has signed it, CRS, the big US organisation, has signed it, and Islamic Relief have signed it. So we've got a mixture of sort of operational stroke partnership agencies and more traditionally partnership focused agencies. And the 8 commitments, I mean, I think in your report, Andras, after 1 year of the Grand Bargain, you actually recognised that the commitments in the Charter for Change had been instrumental in making or encouraging very strong commitments in localisation in the Grand Bargain work stream. So I think that's really encouraging. But what we're now doing as signatories to those 8 commitments of the Charter for Change is actually really trying to work through our processes individually within our organisations to make the changes to live up to those commitments. And actually, you know, you'd think that the partnership-focused agencies would be doing way above 20% funding to local and national actors, and a lot of them are, but actually quite a few aren't. So when we did our first annual report of the Charter for Change, 16 of it was then 29 agencies had signed up. and the amount of money that was being passed through to local actors at the top end was, I think, 80%, but at the bottom end was only 6%. So there's still quite a way to go, but having these commitments has actually helped individual organisations to shift, but also we're sharing practice and learning, and we're setting up groups between us to, improve our processes. And you referred to the issue of recruitment of national NGO staff, and this commitment of Charter for Change was something that was really inspired by what national NGO directors were saying. I think it was at an ICFA conference in Geneva a couple of years ago, where they said, we're fed up of INGOs talking about building up our capacity and giving us institutional capacity strengthening, but the moment a disaster hits, they go and recruit all our staff. Where's the capacity building in that? So there was one partner in one organisation in Philippines, and I think they lost something like 9 of their 12 trained humanitarian staff in the course of 2 disasters to UN agencies and INGOs. So they were left really depleted. So one of the commitments in the Charter for Change is that we won't recruit the national NGO staff during the first 6 months of an emergency, or we'll look at, ways that we can support them. So putting our staff in to work with them rather than taking their staff away. And we did some interesting research. 4 of the Charter for Change agencies did some very interesting research on the effects of this INGO recruitment with national organisations, in looking across the board, but particularly in Philippines, Pakistan and South Sudan. So out of that, agencies, as you said, NCA has now produced a statement to look at it. CAFOD's produced what we've called an ethical recruitment policy. And I think we will see this filter out into the sector as INGOs. I mean, lots of INGOs have said they're not going to stop doing this, but they're going to look at how they can modify it so that it doesn't have such an impact on partners.
All right. Thank you very much for that. The work is in progress, I see, and the discussion and the dialogue is still continuing. As you said, Anne, it seems that the commitments are giving tangible, let's say, benchmarks for organizations to set goals for. I believe that sector-wise, it's quite productive. The grand bargain for smaller NGOs, medium-sized NGOs as well. I think they've been on board. And I think time will tell. What Andras was saying as well is that this needs to be checked and monitored, and this is happening. Now I would like to switch gears a little bit and just talk briefly about 2 other work streams. One was reporting, and then the other one was the cash work stream. And I would like to give the floor to Andras to give a quick recap of those 2 work streams.
Yeah, I mean, so very, very quickly, I think we already talked a little bit about cash, and so this has been one of the most promising areas for reform, because it's sort of like going through the back door. Once you have a system today when you have basically a sector-based division of labor, or you have organizations that are mandated to privilege one group of population, or like focus on one group of population over another. And cash, what it offers is that you can you know, by delivering cash, you don't need these specialized agencies. Basically, you can choose what you need, and even if it's that's a TV instead of new jerry cans, then that's what you're going to buy, and you know that should be okay. In some cases, this is an extreme case, of course, but you know you should be able to decide what you want to buy. Not the humanitarian organization should tell you what services you will need based on their assessment. So I think that has been a very promising area for reform. Unfortunately, the grant bargain hasn't delivered or didn't specify a target as it has for the localization workstream. So whereas you have a 25%, you have an unclear text, but you have a 25% target there. When it comes to cash, the only commitment is to increase the use of cash transfer programs at current low levels. And the current low levels is about, I think, 6%, something like that. So really low. Yeah, I'll just finish there, maybe just leaving a little bit more room for the others. Yeah.
So quickly, because I think we still have, it's 20 minutes, so I think we're doing okay on time. Let me just hand over the microphone to Swati, if you could just tell us a little bit about NCA's cash or reporting approach to those two work streams.
So very briefly, on reporting, we have, you know, for us, it's very important that our partners, they don't spend a lot of time on producing these lengthy reports, 60 pages, 80 pages, and then no one is reading those reports. So we have developed very simplified with very clear-cut guidelines. Junaid is smiling. Guidelines to develop reports. We are not asking our partners to produce like monthly reports and with all this, but very brief. When we ask, it's very brief reports, just quantitative reports, and then maybe end of the project, we are asking for the project end report. Very simplified. Data digitalization is one of the work stream where Grant Bargain is actually putting emphasis, but we have also started to make sure that partners are using this technology to make their work easier. And then, but it's not there yet. We are still working on that. We have started discussions with our partners, because for us, partners are the key. If something is happening like globally, so we don't go to our partners and ask them, okay, it's the new buzzword or new thing in fashion, so let's do it. They have to agree to that, and then if they agree, we have to build their capacity and establish systems for them which is like workable for them. And now we are in discussion, and we have started this. It's work in progress. In terms of cash, all of us we know cash is king. We like it. It's easy. It provides a lot of choices to beneficiaries and prioritize their needs the way they want. But then, as in, we have experience of implementing cash-based programs in different parts of the world with success, with some lessons learned to improve, and now we are actually trying to expand this. Again, we like this word capacity building, but then we have started capacity building on cash-based interventions. Our partners are there, and but we acknowledge that it's not easy, especially where we are implementing our humanitarian response programs, especially in conflict setting. It's not easy. Someone was mentioning that the fund transfer, cash transfer to the areas where people are in need is not easy. It's risky. There are a lot of security risks associated with cash programming. Then, as in, we have this kind of study which shows that in humanitarian action, we try to focus on the most needy and the most marginalized, And then in most cases, the most marginalized are women, are poor, destitutes, and then woman-headed households. So when the cash is distributed, there is a good chance that they face violence from other family members or the community. So we are aware of those challenges as well. Again, it's a work in progress. We really want to expand on this work stream as well, but yeah, long way to go.
And if briefly, if you could also
say very briefly
offer your input.
Yes. Well, to answer your reflection, Andras, on how much change the grand bargain is actually pushing. I think for CAFOD, the cash one has certainly been one where it's pushed us actually beyond our current practice. So after we signed the grand bargain, we did a survey of all our programming to see actually how much we were delivering through cash, because we felt it was really important to have a baseline. And that told us that we were only delivering 7% of our programs through cash. So we decided that we needed to actually have a strategy on this. So we set up a working group which consisted of people across the humanitarian team and drawing on support from some of our partners. And they are working on developing a strategy for that. And lots of energy, I think, that arguably we wouldn't have had this focus without our commitment to the grand bargain. We've also worked at a more global level with our Caritas partners on cash. So Caritas Germany is a sort of lead agency on cash, and they've done some very good training for Caritas member organisations. We've also sent our staff on the CALP, the Cash Accountability and Learning Project trainings, and we've done training for our staff with Emma. So yes, so we are committed to increasing this. So look for our report next year when you're doing the global report. But I think, like you said, Swati, we do also have some concerns about this, and we think it's really important that, we do focus on some of the issues around high risk and highly insecure contexts, and also what are the partner and partnership implications of this, and that needs to be taken into account very carefully as we move forward on this.
Okay, great, thank you. And now I would like to open up the floor for questions. I think we'll take 3 at a time. We don't have much time, so there'll only be 1 round of questions.
I have a question. So since we're trying to promote local capacity and local actors, but at the same time, the SCHR is maybe trying to promote, together with the UN system, a system of certification of these organizations. Is there a linkage in between the what's it called, HQSI or something that SCHR is trying to do? So isn't there a risk that the certification process for local actors, which is already done by the UN in Congo, for instance, so they will only contract with partners who have been certified to be able to do so. But are we extending this kind of certification? That's one thing. And then the thing I do not understand about cash is that you can see it as an objective as such. It's a modality of bringing assistance. And for instance, World Vision, they committed 50% by cash by 2025 or 2020 maybe. But I don't realize this. If you say that you do multi-purpose cash in a country like South Sudan, where you have maybe one medical doctor for 500,000 people, how will these people be able to seek health services? So, well, some of these things, they escape from my mind with this multi-purpose cash assistance. But anyway.
The system of certification is for local actors, yeah? For local actors.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. Just have 4 quick points. Just a quick one, Anne, you mentioned the pool fund, the UN pool fund as the main source for local actors. I would take a little bit of an issue with that. I would argue that it's actually the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement that is the main source of funding to local actors. And I think it's important to put that in perspective, because the discussion on localization, there's a huge role for, obviously, local Red Cross societies and Red Crescent. The other point is, again, on localization, I think it's important, I don't know if my colleague from MSF is here, but there's a very strong difference between conflict and non-conflict areas. Now, we can discuss localization in non-conflict areas. When we get into conflict areas, things become much more complicated, and I think it's important to highlight that. My third point is, Andras, you said that cash would challenge specialization of agencies, if I understood you right. I don't know, I mean, maybe I would like to hear more about it. My understanding is that the UNHCR of this world will continue to serve refugees. They will just do it with cash. So I would like to hear more about that. And last but not least, also on your point, you said it's, I can't remember the word, but something like you were very surprised that the black box doesn't allow the system to know how much funding is going to the beneficiaries. I don't think it's a fair criticism. My colleagues are currently in Bangladesh. I work for the Red Cross, from the Belgian Red Cross, helping the Bangladesh Red Crescent deliver non-food items to Rohingya refugees. Their costs, they're local or they're not local. They come from Belgium. They were there because they were needed. It's a small team. They work with hundreds of volunteers. So I'm just highlighting the fact that it's not only the system that it does not allow that, but it's actually complicated to know what is local, what is not local. Thanks.
My name is Jackson. I work with PH in South Sudan. I just wanted to understand how, these pooled funds can assist in localization and also look at capacity building of the local partners. Because from a context such as South Sudan, you would find that, during the humanitarian response planning process, most of these local NGOs projects do not pass through into the humanitarian response plan, and you will still find international agencies are the main partners that pass, projects that pass through the humanitarian response process. And also, at the end of the day, they are still the ones who are going to access, those funds. So now, looking at the capacity, because, from the failure of their projects passing through the process, maybe it shows, there's a capacity gap in terms of the local partners. How then do you marry allocating money to these local NGOs and their capacity building, given that in South Sudan, there is an unwritten code that there shouldn't be any pass-through organization with regards to pooled funds. You should be a direct implementer of activities.
Say something about that. Yeah, thanks for the question. So at the moment, I think it's between, I think it's 16% of the OCHA country-based pool funds goes directly to national organisations on aggregate across all the 14 pooled funds. But there is a small amount, I think it's 16% for that, and 23% goes to them indirectly. So there is some pass-through from international NGOs. Now, you raise a really good point on capacity strengthening. And I know this is something that the pooled funds have been considering. So OCHA, through their financial coordination section that manages the pooled funds is looking at how they can use the pooled funds more for capacity support for national NGOs, and they actually commissioned some research recently on this, a consultancy, but it's I think it's not completely clear, and the donors that are contribute to the pooled funds also have a bit of difference in opinion between them. So some of them are really keen that the pooled funds provide more money for capacity support, and we might see this in the future, whereas others feel that, you know, that it should stick to the core, you know, to their core missions of providing funding for the response. But I mean, I think you make a good point about wider money going in, and it's not just the pooled funds, because actually the pooled funds are something like 5% of the funding. They're very small. They're a very small amount of the 24 billion that you know, is of humanitarian spending. So, I mean, obviously, OCHA wants to increase this. Some of the donors that are very keen on the pooled funds would like to increase it. But actually, what that figure that you know, the 0.7% of funding going directly doesn't capture is the money that NGOs, that international NGOs provide to their partners. So that's some of the work that we're doing, tracking through the Charter for Change. But I think, you know, it's interesting for the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, the money that's raised in the north and goes directly to the south also needs to be tracked, but also from the federation. So what's the role of the federation in that? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And so the next, I guess it was kind of a group of comments from Bob. Maybe to Andras with the cash flow challenge specialization, and then the black box comment, if you could address that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments and the questions. Regarding cash, what can it realistically replace? Obviously not everything. So when you talk about protection services, nothing. When you talk about you know, shelter, quite a bit. When you talk about food, if markets work, potentially everything. So there's a wide range of the current services that humanitarians provide where cash could make a real difference, and areas where it cannot replace it. So you're right. And I think in that sense, you're right to question why that kind of obsession with this modality. But, you know, let me play a little bit devil's advocate here and say, well, you know, the problem with cash, or the difficulty with cash, has been a sort of mentality of trust, of like, well, we're giving out cash to people, what are they going to spend it on, right? I mean, even the domestic refugee response, if you think about Germany, we have had a long debate of like, oh, well, are we sure we want to give cash to refugees coming in? Like, what are they going to spend it on? Like, why not, you know, tie it to vouchers, you know, food stamps, tie it to work, you know? So there is this whole, despite the evidence that is out there, which is very convincing, that people actually use the money they receive on fulfilling their essential needs, despite that evidence, there is this mentality of trust. And I think this is why it kind of makes sense to still look at the modality itself, to overcome that issue. And on how cash can be transformative, or how can it really make an impact? Well, not by giving out cash contracts to UNHCR, WFP, all these different organizations that just thought, okay, you do the same thing, just do cash. But by saying, okay, by having one big contract per one geographic area and saying, well, this is what your responsibility, you cover all the needs here with this modality. So not going through the same channels of multiple partners, but going like one contractor. And in Lebanon, that experience has been tried and has not been fully successful, to be honest. And I think we don't have time to discuss it, but if you're interested, I'm sure that you know about that experience, but if any other participants are interested, it's worth looking up the experience in Lebanon. I do think the idea is valuable and important, and it makes sense to try it again, just perhaps better.
All right, thank you for that. And then the last, Mr. Jan Waits here, I guess the cash multi-purpose, the relevance of it was answered, but maybe if you wanted to touch on that as well. And then I'll open it up for system of certification for local actors, was the last question.
That I cannot, unfortunately, talk to. I don't know if my colleagues can talk to that question about certification.
I don't know if it's about this due diligence process which UN is doing before.
No, but CAFOD has been always very pushing for the hub international. So it's kind of a certification scheme, and this is still hanging around in the steering committee for humanitarian response. So there is an entity which might come up with a kind of framework of certifying humanitarian partners, but also humanitarian local partners, which would push them in a kind of a continuous process of an assessment of their capacity, of their governance, of the way they practice humanitarian aid. And well, I know CAFOD is a strong supporter of this, but I'm a strong opponent of it. But that's why I was asking the question. So it could lead us, in fact, that we have local partners which are certified to certain criteria, which is the common humanitarian standard, for instance, or the sphere standards, so which could be very difficult for local entities to comply with all of these requirements. And that's what I'm afraid of, that this is the next step of imposing localization, but then imposing also to be certified according to certain criteria and undergo this kind of process every 3 years. That was all.
I think there is quite a lot of support for it in the sector, but I absolutely recognise that you know, there are real dangers, because I think the whole issue of exclusion is quite real. But then, you know, if you look at that in relation to sort of the growing need for accountability and professionalisation, then I think you could argue that it's not a bad thing. And if you look, for example, at the pooled funds or any mechanism, you won't be able to access those funds unless you meet certain criteria. So, you know, it would be in people, in organisations' interest. So you could argue that actually it would be very positive for them. But you're never going to have it such a, you know, it's an ecosystem. It's not, you know, it's never going to reach everybody. But I think, you know, there are real issues around, you know, how donors drive that, I think. But I'll leave it at that.
I see there, unfortunately, we're out of time. But I'm sure that the panelists, if you, after the panel, if anybody would like to approach, then we can do that as well. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all, the audience, for this long, rich, full day of rich conversation. I would also like to thank the panelists. It was an honor to sit next to you. Professor Bragg, thank you very much. NOHA, University of Warsaw, and PAH, thank you very much. It was a great day, and tomorrow morning, I think at 9 a.m. Will be the next program. Thank you very much. Guys.